For more than 3 decades, Grace Whitman lived what many in her small American suburb considered the dream. She and her husband, Thomas, had built a life that seemed both enviable and untouchable. Their neighbors often described them as the couple who had it all: a comfortable home with a well-tended lawn, two grown children who had long since left to start families of their own, and a thriving family business that Thomas had co-founded years earlier. From the outside looking in, the Whitmans were the picture of stability. Their lives appeared carefully constructed around love, loyalty, and hard work. Grace, with her warm smile and gentle composure, was often praised as the quiet strength behind her husband's success. Thomas, confident and ambitious, carried himself as the kind of man who could be trusted with a handshake deal. Together, they seemed to embody the American ideal, a partnership forged through years of sacrifice and devotion. But behind the polished image, Grace had begun to notice something that others could not. At first, it was subtle, too subtle, she told herself, to mean anything at all. A change in the way Thomas carried himself when he came home from work, and the way his eyes seemed to drift off during conversations at dinner. He had always been attentive, always present, but lately his mind seemed elsewhere, his smile a little too forced. The shift in their marriage began, as many such stories do, with excuses. Thomas was spending longer hours at the office, claiming late-night meetings and unexpected deadlines. He brushed off her questions with quick reassurances, always delivered with that easy charm that had once made her fall in love with him. Grace wanted to believe him. After all, this was the man she had trusted with her entire life, and for a time she did. But doubt once planted is difficult to silence. Grace found herself lying awake at night, listening to the even rhythm of Thomas's breathing as he slept beside her. She wanted to believe that nothing had changed, that their marriage was still as strong as the vows they had spoken so many years ago. Yet the unease in her heart grew louder with each passing week. She noticed the way his phone seemed permanently glued to his side, the way he quickly closed his laptop when she walked into the room, the way anniversaries and small traditions that once mattered so much to him seemed to slip from his memory. Theirs had been a marriage built on trust. Grace had never questioned his loyalty, not once in all the decades they had spent together. But now she felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting, as if the life she thought she knew was beginning to crack apart, piece by piece. Neighbors continued to envy her life, unaware of the storm quietly forming within her walls. When friends asked how she and Thomas were doing, Grace smiled politely, offering the practiced responses of a woman who refused to let her doubts show. She told herself it was just a phase, maybe stress from work, maybe the fatigue of age. But deep down she felt the truth pressing at the edges of her heart. Something was wrong. Still, Grace held on to hope. She wanted to believe the man she had loved for most of her life was still the man she thought she knew. She convinced herself that marriages go through seasons, that maybe this was simply one of them. But her intuition, the quiet voice she had learned to trust over the years, refused to let her rest. There was a hollowness in Thomas's presence now, a distance she could not explain. And though Grace tried desperately to ignore it, to bury it beneath her daily routines, she knew in her heart that this was not just a passing storm. Something was unraveling, something she could not yet name. In the quiet of those nights, lying in the bed they had once shared in perfect harmony, Grace felt the faint but unmistakable chill of betrayal creeping in. She didn't have proof, not yet, but she had something far more powerful: the instincts of a woman who knew her husband better than anyone else in the world. And those instincts were telling her that the life she thought she had built, brick by brick, was beginning to crumble in ways she could not yet imagine. Grace tried to quiet her unease, telling herself that after decades of marriage, she was simply overthinking. Every couple faced rough patches, she reminded herself, but still her mind clung to the little inconsistencies, the tiny details that didn't add up. One afternoon, while tidying the kitchen, she stumbled across a receipt tucked into Thomas's jacket pocket. It was for an upscale restaurant on the far side of town, a place Grace had never been. At first, she thought nothing of it. Thomas often entertained clients, and business dinners were hardly unusual. But the date printed on the receipt made her blood run cold. It was their anniversary. That evening, he had told her he'd been caught up in endless meetings, He had come home late, carrying the weary smile of a man who claimed to have worked himself to exhaustion. Grace remembered the sting of disappointment she had felt that night, but she had brushed it aside, forgiving him. Now, holding the receipt in her trembling hand, she saw the night through different eyes. He had been somewhere else, celebrating with someone else, while she sat alone in their home, waiting. Her chest tightened, but she said nothing. Not yet. The days that followed brought more questions than answers. Thomas seemed distracted, offering vague explanations for his absences. He took phone calls in hushed tones, sometimes stepping outside in the middle of dinner. His briefcase grew heavier, though he never let it out of his sight. Grace began to feel like an outsider in her own marriage, standing on the edges of a life she thought she understood. Sleep offered no escape. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding with suspicion. Memories of their life together played through her mind, each one now shadowed by doubt. Were those smiles genuine? Were those business trips ever real? Had she missed the signs all along? It was in these quiet moments that Grace's resolve began to harden. She loved her husband, but love could not silence her instincts. Something was wrong, deeply, terribly wrong. And whether she was ready for the truth or not, she knew she had to uncover it. For years, David Langston had been more than just Thomas's business partner. He was practically family. He attended their holiday dinners, toasted at their children's weddings, and even helped Grace carry groceries when he stopped by the house. She trusted him. Everyone did. But recently, David's presence began to feel different. Grace noticed the way his name slipped more and more into Thomas's conversations. The late nights at the office were suddenly explained by going over figures with David. The weekend golf trips, once rare, became frequent escapes where Thomas insisted business matters were discussed. And though David was always polite, always friendly, there was something about the way he lingered near Thomas that unsettled her. One afternoon, while sipping coffee at a neighborhood cafe, Grace overheard two women chatting at the next table. They spoke casually about seeing Thomas and David together. Shopping, dining, always just the two of them. Like brothers, one of the women had said with a laugh. Grace forced a smile, but her stomach churned. She knew the look on her husband's face when he was in good company. She knew the way his posture changed when he felt understood. And recently, she had seen that look, not when he was with her, but when he was with David. The thought twisted in her chest. Could it be? Could her husband's loyalty, his love, have shifted from their marriage to his business partner? Grace dismissed the idea at first. It felt unthinkable, even absurd. But the longer she watched, the more undeniable it became. She saw the closeness in their private jokes, the way they shared glances that lingered too long. She saw how easily Thomas confided in David, while offering her nothing but silence. The realization struck her like a physical blow. This wasn't just business. This was intimacy. This was trust being given freely to another man, while she was left in the shadows of her own marriage. And with that realization came something far darker. If Thomas could share his heart with David, what else might he be sharing? What secrets lay hidden in the life they had built together, the life she thought she understood? Grace's suspicion, once a whisper, had become a steady drumbeat in her mind. Something was unfolding right in front of her, and she could no longer look away. The questions swirling in Grace's mind finally drove her to do something she had never dared before. For years, Thomas's private office had been a no-go zone, a place he guarded as fiercely as his own. Shadow Grace had always respected his boundaries. She had trusted him enough not to pry, but now that trust felt like a hollow shell, cracked and brittle. One rainy afternoon, with Thomas gone on yet another business meeting, Grace stood outside the office door, her heart hammering in her chest. She hesitated only a moment before turning the handle. Inside, the room smelled of leather and old paper, the air heavy with dust and secrets. Grace's eyes swept over the familiar sight of shelves lined with binders, drawers stacked with receipts, and the polished oak desk where her husband had spent countless nights balancing books. For a moment, she felt foolish, like an intruder in her own home. But then, something caught her eye. A slim folder was tucked between stacks of documents, its edges frayed as though it had been handled often. Grace pulled it free, her hands trembling. She opened it, and the world she knew shattered. Inside were bank statements from an account she had never seen before. Her name was nowhere on them. Instead, the account belonged jointly to Thomas Whitman and David Langston. Her stomach turned as she flipped through page after page. There were deposits in staggering amounts, withdrawals that didn't match anything she knew about their business, and transfers to vendors she had never heard of. And then, at the very back, a deed, a second property, purchased in cash, hidden away under Thomas and David's names. Grace's knees nearly buckled beneath her. All those late nights, all those trips, the anniversary he'd spent elsewhere. It wasn't just about long hours at work. It was about building another life, a double life. Her vision blurred with tears as she sank into the chair at Thomas's desk. The betrayal was not just personal, it was financial, emotional, all-encompassing. For decades, she had believed she was his partner in every sense of the word. Yet here was proof, cold and undeniable, that he had chosen someone else. Not another woman, but the man she had once welcomed into her home as family. Grace clutched the deed in her hands, her pulse racing. She felt anger rising like fire in her chest, but beneath it was something even stronger, clarity. She had spent years telling herself she was imagining things, that her instincts were wrong, but now she had proof, undeniable proof, that the life she thought she knew was nothing but a carefully constructed lie. The home she had built with love and loyalty was tainted. Every memory now felt like it belonged to strangers. And as the storm raged outside the windows, Grace whispered to herself the words she never thought she'd say. It was never just business. That evening, when Thomas returned home, Grace was waiting for him in the living room. The folder sat on the coffee table between them, its contents neatly arranged like evidence in a courtroom. For the first time in decades, she did not greet him with a kiss or a smile. She sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the man she thought she knew. Thomas paused when he saw the documents. His confident stride faltered. He tried to mask it with his usual easy charm, but Grace caught the flicker of panic in his eyes. "What's all this?" he asked lightly, as though the papers were nothing more than old receipts. Her voice, when it came, was steady but cold. "You tell me. Because I found bank accounts I never knew existed. I found property you never mentioned. And David's name is on every single page." For a moment, silence hung between them like a noose. Then Thomas sighed and sank into the chair across from her. He didn't deny it. Not exactly. Instead, he offered half-truths and slippery words. "It's complicated, Grace. The business needed flexibility. Some things are better left off the books. David and I, well, we made arrangements. Nothing you need to worry about." But Grace wasn't the woman who once accepted his excuses at face value. Her hands clenched into fists. "Not my concern? You built this life with me. Every brick, every sacrifice. We did it together. And now I find out there's a whole other life I was never meant to see?" Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his voice dropping. "You wouldn't understand. It's not what it looks like." But Grace saw it clearly. The lies, the secrecy, the intimacy he had chosen to share with David instead of her. She felt the weight of decades crash down on her shoulders, every moment of trust now poisoned. She stared at him, her voice trembling with equal parts rage and heartbreak. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To us? You've destroyed everything we built together. Not just our marriage, our family, our name, our life." Thomas leaned forward, desperation creeping into his voice. "Grace, please. It's business, that's all. David and I, we needed this. For the company. For the future." She shook her head slowly, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. "Don't lie to me. This isn't just business. It's betrayal. And you made me the fool who never saw it coming." The confrontation left the room heavy with silence. For the first time in their marriage, Grace saw him not as her husband, not even as her partner, but as a stranger. A man who had carved out a secret world behind her back and thought he could keep her blind forever. When he finally reached across the table, hoping to grasp her hand, she pulled back sharply. The look in her eyes was enough to stop him cold. "You don't get to touch me," she whispered. "Not anymore." In that moment, something inside Grace shifted. The trust that had carried her through decades of marriage was gone, replaced by something harder, sharper. She realized she could never go back, not to who she was, not to the marriage she thought she had, and certainly not to the man sitting in front of her. The confrontation was over, but its consequences had only begun. Grace felt a hollow ache inside her chest, but beneath it burned the first sparks of something new: resolve. Because now she knew she could no longer live in denial. The truth was out, and the truth demanded action. In the days after the confrontation, the house fell into a heavy silence. Thomas moved through their home like a ghost, muttering apologies one moment and defending himself the next. Grace barely listened. His words sounded hollow, like a man rehearsing lines to save face. Her trust was gone, and with it, her patience. But something inside her kept gnawing. The hidden bank accounts, the property deed, the secrecy, none of it felt like mere infidelity or bad business decisions. There was something larger at play, something Thomas hadn't confessed. Grace could feel it. One morning, while Thomas was at yet another meeting, she returned to the office. This time she searched with purpose, combing through every drawer, every folder, every file he had tucked away. For hours she found nothing but old contracts and tax documents. Then, tucked inside a locked drawer at the bottom of the desk, she discovered a leather-bound journal. Her hands shook as she pried it open. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's. Page after page documented meetings with David, details of cash transactions, coded references to offshore accounts, and cryptic notes about covering tracks. But what stopped Grace cold were the entries about her. Insurance policies filed. Grace remains obstacle. Her breath caught in her throat. She flipped to the next page. More references to finalizing the plan and chilling phrases like, "Once she's gone, everything's ours." Grace's heart pounded in her chest. She read the words again, desperate to convince herself she had misunderstood. But the meaning was clear. Thomas and David hadn't just been hiding money. They hadn't just been building a second life. They were plotting to erase her completely. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. All those late nights, the sudden distance, the guarded behavior. It wasn't only betrayal of the heart. It was betrayal of her very life. Grace clutched the journal to her chest, her mind spinning. The man she had loved, the man she had built a home and a family with, had looked her in the eye each morning while secretly plotting her disappearance. And the partner she had once welcomed as family, David, was his co-conspirator. The betrayal cut so deep it left her breathless. It wasn't only about another life hidden from her. It was about the deliberate destruction of the one she had built. She closed the journal slowly, her trembling hands turning to fists. The fear that had gripped her began to give way to something sharper. Rage, determination. Grace realized then that she had two choices: remain the victim of their plot or become the one who exposed it. And in that quiet, heavy office, surrounded by evidence of their lies, she vowed she would not be erased. Her marriage was over. Her life as she knew it was shattered. But Grace Whitman was far from finished. For 2 nights after finding the journal, Grace barely slept. She would lie in bed beside Thomas, listening to the sound of his steady breathing, and wonder how a man could rest so peacefully while plotting the destruction of his own wife. Every glance he gave her, every casual word, now felt like a mask, one worn by a stranger she no longer recognized. But while he slept, Grace's mind was awake, sharp, calculating. Fear had given way to a cold, steady resolve. She could not allow herself to remain the silent victim in Thomas and David's twisted scheme. If they thought she was weak, if they thought she would crumble under the weight of betrayal, they were wrong. She began with small steps, careful not to alert him. She photocopied the bank statements, the property deed, and most importantly, the pages of the journal that laid out their chilling plans. She stored the copies in a safe place, a trusted friend's home, knowing that one day she might need them. Next, she tested her performance. Around Thomas, she softened her tone, pretended to accept his explanations. She feigned weariness, even offering a strained smile when he suggested that things would get better. Her silence became her weapon. The less she resisted, the more relaxed he became. He believed she was broken. that she had given up. He had no idea she was simply biding her time. When David stopped by the house one afternoon, Grace greeted him with the same warmth she had always shown. She poured him coffee, asked about the business, even joked about how hard he and Thomas were working. Beneath her calm demeanor, her stomach churned, but she forced herself to hold his gaze, to study him. David, smug and unsuspecting, played his part, never realizing she knew the depth of his betrayal. But Grace wasn't just watching them. She was building her own network. Quietly, she confided in her oldest friend, Marianne, slipping her pieces of the story. She met with their longtime family lawyer under the pretense of reviewing paperwork, carefully planting seeds of suspicion about the finances. And she began discreetly reaching out to authorities, asking pointed questions about fraud and insurance. Every step was deliberate, every move designed to expose Thomas and David on her terms. At home, she kept a journal of her own. Late at night, by the dim glow of her bedside lamp, she wrote out her pain in sharp, precise sentences. But alongside the pain, she drafted a plan, a counterplot that would not only protect her life, but unravel theirs. Grace knew she couldn't strike recklessly. Men like Thomas and David thrived on control, and they had spent years perfecting their deception. To beat them, she had to be just as meticulous, just as patient. She would smile when she needed to. She would play the part of the weary, forgiving wife. She would even let them believe they still held the upper hand. But all the while, she was gathering, preparing, waiting for the perfect moment to turn their secret world inside out. What Thomas and David didn't realize was that the woman they had dismissed as an obstacle was becoming their greatest threat. Grace wasn't going to simply survive their betrayal. She was going to dismantle it, piece by piece, until the empire they had built together collapsed under the weight of their own lies. The night Grace had been waiting for finally arrived. Weeks of silence, of pretending, of careful planning, all of it had led to this moment. She had set the trap with precision, disguising it as an act of reconciliation. With a calm voice, she invited Thomas and David to the house, suggesting they sit down together and talk things through. Both men accepted without hesitation. They believed she was defeated. They believed she was broken. But Grace Whitman was not broken. She was ready. The house was perfectly arranged when they arrived. Candles flickered softly on the dining table. Wine glasses glinted in the low light. To anyone else, it would have seemed like an intimate evening between old friends. But beneath the polished surface, the air was thick with tension. Thomas arrived first, his expression cautious but relieved when Grace greeted him with a faint smile. Minutes later, David walked through the door, his voice booming with forced cheer, as though his presence could erase years of deception. Grace poured them each a glass of wine, her own hand steady despite the storm raging inside her. They sat across from her, relaxed in their arrogance, certain that whatever suspicion she had would be smoothed over tonight. Grace let the silence stretch before she began. Her voice was calm even, but laced with steel. "I invited you both here tonight because I want clarity," she said, her eyes fixed on Thomas. "For decades I trusted you. I built my life around you, but you betrayed me. You both did." Thomas shifted uncomfortably, opening his mouth to speak, but Grace raised her hand sharply, silencing him. She reached to the side and placed the leather-bound journal on the table with a soft, deliberate thud. David's face blanched. "I know about the secret accounts. I know about the property. I know about the fraud," she continued, her voice growing firmer with each word. Then after a pause, she leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "And I know about the insurance policies. I know you planned for a future without me." The room froze. Thomas's skin drained of color, his mouth working soundlessly as though words had abandoned him. David's eyes darted from the journal to Grace, searching for some way to explain the unexplainable. Grace's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "I've made copies of everything. The authorities already have them. The lawyer has them. Your empire, your schemes, your lives, they're already unraveling." Thomas finally found his voice, but it cracked under the weight of his panic. "Grace, please. It's not what you think." She slammed her hand against the table, the sharp sound silencing him. "Don't you dare tell me what to think. You were ready to erase me. You plotted against me in my own home, while I trusted you with everything I had, and now it's over. You've lost," neither man spoke. Their confidence was gone, stripped away in a single evening by the woman they had underestimated. Grace rose slowly to her feet, her voice steady and final. "Leave my house. Whatever life you imagined for yourselves is finished. From this moment forward, I am no longer your victim. I am free." For a moment, Thomas remained seated, his shoulders slumped, his eyes filled with something between shame and defeat. David glanced at him, but found no ally, no defense. Together the two men stood and walked toward the door, their footsteps heavy, their world collapsing around them. When the door shut behind them, Grace exhaled, her body trembling with release. The house was silent again, but this silence was hers. Not the silence of suspicion or betrayal, but the silence of triumph. For the first time in weeks, she felt the weight lift from her chest. She had faced them, she had stripped them bare, and in doing so, she had taken back not only her life, but her power. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of Grace's confrontation spread quickly. Word of Thomas and David's betrayal and fraud reached the authorities, the community, and soon the very business they had built together. Investigators uncovered a tangled web of financial manipulation, hidden accounts, and suspicious insurance policies. For years, Thomas had been the man people trusted with contracts, with handshakes, with promises. Now his name was whispered in the same breath as betrayal and fraud. David, once admired for his sharp business sense, found his reputation in ruins. The empire they had constructed collapsed, not under the weight of bad luck, but under the truth Grace had brought into the light. Neighbors who had once envied Grace's life now rallied around her. Friends came with casseroles, shoulders to cry on, and words of admiration. They called her strong, brave, a survivor. Grace accepted their kindness with quiet gratitude, but inside she knew her strength had not come easily. It had been forged in heartbreak, in betrayal, in the long nights when she wondered if she'd even survive. Still, she did more than survive. She reclaimed herself. In the weeks that turned into months, Grace began to rebuild, not just her home, but her identity. She moved into a smaller house, one filled with sunlight and open space. Gone were the heavy drapes and dark corners that reminded her of secrets. Instead, her new space breathed of freedom. She painted, something she hadn't done in years. She traveled to see her children and grandchildren, finding joy in the laughter of family untainted by lies. Most importantly, Grace gave herself permission to live, to dream again. On quiet mornings, she would sip coffee by the window, watching the sunrise paint the sky. The scars of betrayal were still there. Some wounds never fully heal, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they became reminders of what she had endured and how she had risen. She thought often of the night she had faced Thomas and David, the way their confidence had crumbled under her steady gaze. They had believed she would be erased, silenced, forgotten. But she had proven them wrong. She had shown them that betrayal might break trust, but it could not break her. One afternoon, sitting across from her closest friend, Grace spoke words she hadn't allowed herself before. "They thought they were ending me," she said, her voice steady. "But really, they freed me. For the first time in my life, I'm living on my own terms." Her friend squeezed her hand, tears glistening in her eyes. Grace smiled softly, a weary but genuine smile. For decades, she had defined herself as Thomas's wife, the loyal partner in his life, in his business. Now she was something more. She was Grace Whitman, her own woman with her own story and her own future. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting warm light across her new home, Grace felt it deep within her soul. She was free. Free from deception, free from betrayal, free to begin again. This was her rebirth. Her reckoning had passed, and her life, unbroken, untethered, and fully her own, was just beginning.